I was asked once. I did a panel, and it was a question that kind of caught me off guard. And the panelist at the end said, "Sean, will you sell capitalism as a system? What would you do to sell that?" And I thought, oh my gosh. And the thing I came up with at first was like, well, if you like individual freedom and choice, then capitalism is for you, right? Now again,
right.
That doesn't mean that everybody has the same range of choices, and that doesn't mean that everybody can purchase the same products and so forth.
Right.
But in terms of other systems where you have limited choices or no choice at all, that's the selling point of capitalism. I think that's why that system tends to win out when it's in competition with other systems. It's why I think the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because of these wide geopolitical factors, but ultimately I think the Soviet Union collapsed because it could not provide the high standards of living and consumer choices for its citizens.
I'm here with Dr. Sean Adams. He's the Hyatt and Cici Brown Professor of History and specializes in the history of American capitalism and energy. You explore, for example, you have books where you explore relationships of fossil fuel in the U.S. The book is called Home Fires, How America Kept Warm in the 19th Century. And you have history of, the first book is, can you remind me of that again?
Old Dominion Industrial Commonwealth.
Old Dominion Industrial Commonwealth. Yeah. Thank you. You also lead the Inquire Capitalism program, which is kind of like resources for students and researchers about the general public history of capitalism and companies. And you have a really cool blog called EnergyPast, where you talk about like energy, you mention articles and react to them and give your thoughts on like general energy and capitalism matters.
Yep.
So yeah, thank you for being here. This is great. This is very interesting because capitalism, it's one of those things that is kind of like very feisty. Like people have very strong opinions on one way or the other. So it's cool that you're interested in the history of it, right? So like why capitalism? Why you were interested in that? Touch a little bit on that because I wanted to ask you the motivations, maybe a little bit later, but like why and what, right? Like what is capitalism?
Right.
What would it be interesting? And then we can get started a little bit into what is the history of the U.S. related to capitalism, specifically in the 19th century, because as I've kind of seen, it's kind of like where the beginnings of what like maybe people would call like a hardcore capitalism or something like that.
Yeah.
Sure. What are your thoughts?
So, like how I got into the history of capitalism? I mean, it's interesting. When I went to college at Purdue University, I didn't think that I wanted to do history. Okay. I thought I might want to be an engineer, and then calculus kind of ruled that out. And so I had a history class, and I realized that I was always kind of interested in history. And I found that the things that most interested me about U.S. history were those kinds of economic questions. Most people get into history, they're interested in wars, or they're interested in slavery, or they're interested in, political movements. And for me, the thing that always kind of captivated me were these questions of how people worked, how they envisioned themselves making money, how they tried to kind of advance themselves. And so when I went to graduate school, I became really interested in those kinds of questions. And I also became interested in these questions of political economy. So how do you structure a state system, a government system that is best suited for economic growth and development? It probably helps that my father was an economist. Okay. So that probably, he's probably subconsciously planting all these questions in my mind. And so I was looking for a topic, something that was going to look at the difference between economic and industrial development in both a slave state and a free state. I was really interested in the 19th century. I was really interested in the impact of slavery. And so I kind of came to this question of, well, maybe I could find two individual states within the United States that had very similar kind of starting circumstances, and they diverged in very different directions. And so that became the basis of my dissertation. I came across the case studies of Pennsylvania and Virginia, and that they both had coal, different types of coal, albeit, but they both had a lot of coal. They both had big populations. They both had big aspirations to kind of grow. Virginia was a slave state. Pennsylvania was a free state. And so what I did was, and this became my first book, Old Dominion Industrial Commonwealth, was I looked at the ways that both of those states kind of developed or tried to encourage the development of their coal industries in the 19th century. So Pennsylvania was a free state. They had all sorts of incentives to create corporate charters. They had a geological survey that they went out and they found all these new minerals and so forth. They really, really encouraged it and allowed it to grow. And Pennsylvania became the most dynamic industrial state, I think, in the 19th century. Virginia was very different. It was dominated by planters politically, who were from the eastern part of the state, and they seemed to organize their entire kind of state-level political economy around protecting slavery. So both those places are capitalist in nature, right? But they're very, very different types of capitalism. And so that was the first interest to me. Then I had done so much research on the coal industry that for my second book, I tackled these kind of bigger questions about energy and capitalism.
Okay.
So that's how I got into it originally.
So we can get started a little bit on that. So to give context, these questions that you started to pose yourself at the beginning were like beginning of 1800s,
yeah,
right?
Sure, yeah.
So like pre-Civil War, they started to just different states, as you mentioned, but they are still part of like a single union or like of the same entity. But then Civil War breaks out, right? Like if you want to, we can get a little bit deeper into the Civil War, but maybe just to do the big story short, Civil War happens, then Union happens, and at the end we have again a union of states, but very different states. So like what happened in there that after the Civil War, one of the biggest things that happened is like the emancipation of the states, right? Like proclamation of Emancipation Proclamation. So like now state slavery is technically illegal, right? So like what happens there? Like now that this kind of shift happens, what are the contexts politically and economically that like those? I think of myself like those are like the starting points. Like what were those starting points, and then kind of how those developed in the U.S. in like those states in the U.S. in general across all of the 19th century.
So my book and my interest really start around the time of the foundation of the United States. So I was looking at the 1790s.
Right.
That's when I started, and I found those kind of divergent paths, right? Because if you look at, for example, the role that government plays in economic development, in the formation of capitalism, it's really not the federal government. That's more of a New Deal, more of a 20th century phenomenon. It's really state governments, right? And because state governments in the period before the Civil War were so different in that many of them had slavery and many of them did not, then that was kind of my basis for comparison. But you're right. After the Civil War, once slavery is abolished by the 13th Amendment, you do get this, at least in coal, which was what I was writing about, you still get these different kind of approaches to it. And then what Virginia did basically was try to catch up as quickly as possible. And so what they did is essentially abandoned any oversight over the development of coal. They let corporations that were chartered in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New York kind of come in and develop their coal industry. Whereas in Pennsylvania, you had much more of a kind of homegrown approach. They had much more synergy between, say, coal and iron and steel and so forth. Whereas in places like Virginia, and this was true across the South, any place where industrialization occurred was largely extractive. You're largely taking the materials, the resources out of the South and shipping it up to the North. I mean, there were some pockets of places like northern Alabama where you had a steel industry that developed there. But by and large, after the Civil War, the South and the North are still kind of moving in different directions. And the North is industrializing much more rapidly. And it's really until the 1930s that the South even begins to catch up to the North. And that's largely because the Great Depression has happened and the North is kind of coming down to the level of the South. If we look at it in terms of, say, per capita income or wage rates or all kinds of indices of economic development. So that profound difference between free states and slave states that I was really interested in as a grad student and still interested in it has such a legacy in the United States. I mean, it's still with us today, right? We still kind of conceive of southern states having a kind of different approach to economic development than northern states. Southern states are low tax, no unions, rapid development, very, very pro-business environments. Not that northern states are anti-business, but they tend to have a lot more regulations.
Which was not necessarily the same in those times that we're
mentioning. No. It's not the same. It's not the same at all. But there are these different,
an interesting shift.
Yeah, there are these different styles that kind of develop. And I would argue as a historian that they have kind of long roots in American capitalism. That if we look at the state level, and what I was really interested in for my first book, where this was this idea of a kind of almost like an identity of a state. What did they want to do? What did they want to develop? And in Pennsylvania, it was very much industrial, whereas in Virginia, it was very much agricultural.
So we can go a little bit deeper in there. Like, what was that identity that each of them had? What were the ideals that guided their economic decisions?
Yeah.
Right. Like what were those economic decisions, and what were the consequences of those?
Right. So for example, in Pennsylvania, it's very, very pro-development. And the idea was that you would use things like in the 19th century, what we would today call infrastructure, they called internal improvements, which I think is a really interesting kind of concept. Right. The idea is you're improving on nature, right? So you have rivers that you can travel on and so forth, but canals were essentially meant to be an improvement on a river. And in Pennsylvania, they were very, very, very supportive early on of internal improvements, of building a statewide system of canals, then encouraging the growth of railroads, which they thought then would encourage the growth of coal mining, the growth of iron and steel production, the growth of textiles. All of that stuff was really important to policymakers in Pennsylvania. In Virginia, because the legislature was dominated by these planters mostly east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, you had much more of an emphasis on agriculture. Not so much tobacco, that had kind of passed from the colonial period, but wheat and other crops that used slave-based labor, right? What they would often do, so Virginia goes through this period of economic decline in the period before the Civil War, largely because their soil is not as fertile as it was, because in part they raise tobacco, which is really enervating in the soil. And so for them, the goal wasn't the same as Pennsylvania's to kind of grow industrially. The goal for them was to recapture some of that kind of agricultural prowess that they had seen early on in their colony's history. So, for example, whereas Pennsylvania had a geological survey, this is one of my chapters in my book, they had a geological survey that went around looking for mineable seams of coal and iron ore, and essentially underwrote the cost of doing that. So these were public documents, right? So the state geologist would go around, he would say, here's a really good seam of coal. It's close to a railroad or a canal, so this is something that's sense, right for development, and that's free, right? Because the state is underwriting it. In Virginia,
underwriting it is like sponsoring, like
they paid for it. Yeah. So they would have these state geological surveys where they would have state-paid geologists that would go around and try to find all this stuff. What's really worked out for me, this is one of those things that it's a gift, is that Virginia and Pennsylvania both had state geological surveys, and the geologists were brothers. Right? Okay, so they wrote to each other all the time.
Yeah.
So it was really, so when you're doing a comparative study, that's the best way to do a comparative study, because they were brothers, and Henry Rogers, who was running the Pennsylvania State Geological Survey, and William Rogers, who was running the Virginia one, were always kind of comparing notes. And for Henry, it was always like, God, they complained a lot to each other about their bosses.
Which is perfect for you, right? Because you get to see the
I get to see the complaints, and so they're complaining about the legislature because they don't think that these legislators believe in science the way that they do, right? They're both geologists for the scientific reasons. And Henry, the guy in Pennsylvania, keeps saying, they always are saying, why don't you find iron next to coal, and then and then we can develop those areas. And he's like, that's not the way geology works, but that's the way they were thinking, right? And then William was basically told by the Virginia legislature, we're not that interested in you finding iron or coal. What we're really interested in you finding is this material called marl, which essentially is mineral fertilizer, because the task was to reinvigorate the soil. So William's always complaining, like, I'm finding these great, seams of coal, I'm finding iron ore, I'm finding all this industrial stuff. They're not interested in that at all. What they want is more and more marl. So I took that as an example of how these two kind of state-level political economies were so different. And it had real developmental implications in that in Virginia, which eventually, so Virginia includes West Virginia in the period before the Civil War. West Virginia comes out of Virginia. And West Virginia will become one of the leading coal mining states. There is a ton of bituminous coal in West Virginia. But the way that it develops is very fundamentally different from the way that coal develops in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the coal tends to go to large cities or stay in the general vicinity of Pennsylvania and be used for making iron and steel and so forth. Whereas in Virginia, that coal is just extracted out. They don't tax it. They don't really do anything to it. And so you get into the 20th century, these mining wars, I don't know if you're familiar with those, between labor and capital, just really ugly, violent mine wars, because basically the miners in West Virginia in the late 19th and early 20th century felt like they were being exploited. They were living in these company towns, they were paying higher prices and so forth. And what you didn't have was the same kind of urban development and kind of holistic industrial development that you had in Pennsylvania. So in West Virginia, you had this idea, West Virginians especially believed that they were kind of an economic colony of northern states like Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania. And all of that, I argued, had its roots in deep in history.
Deep in history, you mean like the economic decisions that came before? Yeah,
these paths had been forged in the early 19th century. Right. And although the circumstances changed, I mean, slavery ended, right, in 1865. But you still had this legacy of a very agrarian political economy. And so then once Virginians and West Virginians tried to develop their industrial resources, they had to do so kind of from scratch. They didn't have, 4 or 5 decades of experience in doing this. So they had to build railroads quickly. They had to build mines quickly. And when they did that, what they essentially did was to kind of farm all that out to well-established corporations that were already operating in the North. So there was a kind of colonial relationship in that a lot of the capital and a lot of the organizational talent was coming from outside the state.
Okay. And then what absolutely. Yeah. What happened after? So this relationship stayed like that you had like this colonial relationship between the like West Virginia and Pennsylvania, for example. How did that evolve over time? Because you mentioned at the end, then came these big corporations, right? Like, and I think that's kind of one of the big pieces that people think about when they think of like the 19th century, at least the latter part, right? Like the Gilded Age would be the encompassing term, right? Yeah. So what happened after? Like, how did this initial state that you described evolve into the latter part of the 19th century? So
the thing that I'm really fascinated by is industrial development, right?
Right.
Industrialization. Right. In fact, that's my newest book project is a more broader history of industrialization, American industrialization, from the 1790s up through the 1930s, with an emphasis on energy, obviously, because that's what I study. But that's what really fascinates me is kind of how societies change and industrialize. And although the United States is one country, and it became a much tighter union in the period after the Civil War, what really fascinates me about American industrialization is its unevenness. And that unevenness is going to continue well into the 20th century.
Unevenness like inequality?
Sure, you could call it inequality, but what I mean is that in the 19th century, there are, if you look, for example, at railroad development, there are these dense railroad networks that develop up north. And it's kind of self-reinforcing, right? As you have dense railroad networks,
I see what you mean.
You need steel to build those railroads. Right. So you have steel plants. And then just
all of that happens in like a hub, and then everything else is like not connected to that necessarily.
And so what you see is these patterns that begin in, say, places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's why I like
move
all of those
western
cities.
To where Chicago then becomes a big railroad hub.
Right.
And then eventually the railroads are going to extend across the continent. But in the South, what you're getting is because for most of the South's history in the 19th century, they were mainly raising cotton. And a certain small number of Southern planters made a ton of money from cotton. It was a very, very valuable crop. But that wealth was not spread out evenly. I mean, 1/3 of Southerners, for example, are enslaved African Americans, right? So they're getting none of that wealth. But even then, the concentrations of wealth that the Cotton South creates are very, very skewed towards the top, few folks. And I want to make the argument that industrialization somehow makes everybody equal and everybody happy. It doesn't, right? There are workers, there are managers, and there are capitalists who become fabulously wealthy in the North. But I would argue that what industrial development does do is it creates more opportunities. Right. Because the wealth there is not necessarily based in land ownership the way it is in the South for most of the 19th century. It's a much more mobile form of wealth and an opportunity. And so you get these dense networks up north, which I find really interesting. And that pattern kind of continues, as I said, into the 20th century, to the point where the South, because they're kind of playing economic catch-up for most of the early, almost all of the late 19th century, and then into the early 20th century, they tend to try to develop as quickly as possible. And so you get things like low tax regimes. You get things like a real avarice towards unions. Mm-hmm. And so creating a kind of pro-business environment becomes very important to southern states. Mm-hmm. Still is, if you look at, for example, the way that Florida and Texas market themselves, right? We are pro-business, we are low tax, we do not have strong unions. I believe that all of that comes out of the kind of industrializing era. And that's where those patterns are set. Now, they do change, and you do get industrial development in places like Texas and Florida, but not as much. And it's not the kind of stuff that I'm interested in.
Right. And it's interesting because in my mind, before you just said this last sentence, I was thinking that in my mind, capitalism has this certain specific definition, mm-hmm. and that when you were talking about like the difference between the northern and the southern states, I was thinking, okay, like the northern states are kind of embracing more capitalism, right? Like are bringing more like this pro-business like expansion, like whatever works for like the consumer. Let's figure out how if the consumer wants cheaper, whatever, or wants to keep their house hot. Then let's build these networks, let's mm-hmm. build this interconnection, let's create these factories. Yeah. And whereas the South was a bit more, I guess, was like not as open to those ideas. However, the last sentence was kind of interesting because then you said, okay, now let's embrace more pro-business side, which mm-hmm. in my mind is like it's like at least like the direction of capitalism, right? Like staying away of, maybe like you could say government inclusion and like regulation, as you said, and more businesses taking over like the economic decisions, right? Yeah. Like what would you say is then, like, what is the differences in there that led to what we know as the Gilded Age, right? Like because the Gilded Age focuses mostly on the North, right?
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, so
or like what people tend to associate as the Gilded Age,
for sure. Because, well, I mean, when you think about the Gilded Age, and there's actually a big discussion among historians as to whether we should still call it the Gilded Age, but we don't have a good substitute for that. So,
okay, I don't even know what Gilded. What is Gilded? Like,
it comes from a novel that was written by Mark Twain, where he talks about kind of the ideas that. That it's gilded on the outside, it's nice and shiny, but on the inside,
and he was criticizing
it's kind of corrupt, right?
Right. I've heard about this. Yeah.
So if we think about, let's just unpack the kind of cliches about the Gilded Age, right?
Right. Yeah, please.
Become fabulously wealthy, like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, right? And these names that we've all heard of. Jay Gould gets wealthy in railroads and other kinds of speculation. And so I think that a couple of things happen. First of all, you get this explosion of industrial development in the post-Civil War North. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. a lot of that has to do, for example, with railroad construction.
Right, as you were saying. Right.
So what Andrew Carnegie does is he realizes, now he's a wealthy man by the time of the Civil War, but what he realizes is there's going to be an unlimited demand for high quality American steel. Right. So he gets into making steel. And he develops what economists call economies of scale, right? So in other words, building big factories that basically are very, very efficient. And what they're focused on is increasing throughput. That is the time it takes for the raw materials to enter one side of the factory and get out of the other side. But what he's also interested in doing is cutting costs, right? So there are a couple of big themes in American industrialization in this period that the Gilded Age is kind of created by. And it's this relentless cost cutting is one of them. Because the idea is for the Carnegies and the Rockefellers is we're in a competitive environment, right? And what you need to do is cut your costs low enough so that you can consistently undercut your competitors, right? And why do you do that? You do that so that you can increase market share.
Right.
And then once you have enough market share, you can then set prices essentially, right? Now, the negative side of that is we call that monopoly. Right. So, but if you want to know what motivates Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan, a lot of these people, it's the idea of being a price maker, not a price taker. In other words, it's creating these companies, these businesses that are so big and so powerful that essentially they don't have to depend on the market anymore. They are creating the market, right? To the point where you get, for example, an American sugar refining company controls 98% of the country's sugar refining capacity. Now, the backlash to that in the Gilded Age was antitrust. In 1890, Congress passes the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the idea is to maybe control some of these large businesses a little bit. But what historians have said is, look, if these businesses keep cutting costs and lowering prices, the benefits passed on to the consumer, right? And although they're monopolies, and we don't like maybe the impact that they have on our political system, ultimately they're doing society a good by creating all of this cheap steel, by creating all of this cheap kerosene that we can use to illuminate our interiors. And so that's kind of the deal that many business historians argue that kind of the American public made with big business. You keep our costs low, you keep increasing our standard of living, and we, in a way, will kind of surrender a lot of this power and authority to you.
Was that actually what happened, would you say?
Well, it's complicated, obviously, as all of history is. But I do think that there's a big difference between the kind of way in which we conceive of the Gilded Age politically, which is this age of kind of unfettered corruption, of big money kind of having influence over government, and the economic side of it, which is you get an increasing kind of rationalization and increasing efficiency of a lot of these networks. I mean, that's kind of what I write about in Home Fires in the earlier period when I talk about the kind of coal distribution network. Is it just keeps getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And the good side of that for coal consumers is they're not paying as much to heat their homes. The bad side of that is you get these large corporations like the Philadelphia and Reading Company that have an undue amount of power and influence over the coal fields and over consumer markets. So, I guess the question is, without me making a judgment on that, is that a fair trade-off, right? Are you willing to trade off the idea of having these kind of large companies, these fabulously wealthy individuals, for low prices, right? And for increased services? You're able to keep your home warmer cheaply, but the people who are maybe paying for that are the coal miners who are finding their wages suppressed more and more and more and more. So industrialization can sometimes set up those kinds of internal battles between Americans, right? Who's benefiting from these things?
Which ideally, normally in the time when I think of capitalism, the question is who's benefiting. Necessarily is both everyone, right? Like if
in
you're
theory,
right,
yes.
like if you're making a deal, like in my mind, if you're making a deal and I'm paying you for something, is because I value what you have more than the money that I have.
Right.
And if you're selling me something, it's because you value more the money that I can give you than what the actual thing. So like it's a win-win, right? So like I guess it's a matter of like who wins more. Right. And then the psychology comes in of like, okay, even though my standard of living is better, like I can keep my home hotter for longer or better. But then there's this other person that is making millions and billions of dollars. Then what is my relationship to that? Like, am I upset about that? Am I okay because I can keep my like.
Well, so here's an interesting thing that I do in my class, because my history of capitalism class starts really in the colonial era of the United States, before the United States is even a country. And they read, the students read that section in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was 1776. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the idea is, he has this great turn of phrase where he says, it's not from the benevolence of the baker or the butcher that we get our daily meal. It's from their self-interest. Right. And so Adam Smith's model that he sets up for capitalism, and he's often, referred to as the kind of prophet of capitalism and the inventor of capitalism. He's none of those things. He's simply describing what he thinks is the reality of the situation, which is that if you allow people to pursue their self-interests, and you don't, for example, set the price of bread, there are enough incentives, and the invisible hand of the market, that's the kind of term that he coins, will actually keep the price of bread low, because bakers will start competing with each other, right, to sell the most bread. And so as that price goes down, society benefits, right? It's like you said, the trade benefits both parties, right? Now, what Adam Smith is setting up, though, is a system that's pretty rudimentary, right? I mean, by the late 19th century, we're not talking about bakers and butchers anymore. We're talking about multi-million-dollar, corporate ventures that, for example, in the early 20th century, U.S. Steel owns iron mines in Minnesota. They own coal mines in Pennsylvania. They own steel factories in up the river in Pittsburgh.
Like
these massive, industrial ventures. And the idea that under a Smithian system, that I, as an individual, am just going to say, like, I think I'll get into the steel business, right? It's ludicrous. So what Smith could never envision, because he's writing, of course, in 1776, before the real kind of industrial revolution starts in earnest, certainly the American Industrial Revolution, he's envisioning this very kind of small-scale society in which that kind of rough equality of capitalism might work. But what folks who were arguing against kind of unfettered capitalism, unregulated capitalism, what they would have argued is that system doesn't exist anymore. Competition is not just simply, I think I'm pretty good at something, I'm going to jump into this business, right? And in fact, what they argued, the argument behind antitrust is, what folks like John D. Rockefeller was doing in kerosene was actually thwarting competition. So I'll give you an example. If you were, let's just say that you wanted to compete with Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's company. And let's say Standard Oil controls 50% market share, right? And you can produce maybe 10% market share, and you develop this new system that you think is going to undercut him on price, right? So John D. Rockefeller is selling kerosene at, say, $1 a gallon, and you say, I can sell it for 95 cents a gallon. That's the way capitalism is supposed to work, right? That's innovation. That's Adam Smith's system. Yeah, it's in your self-interest to make things cheaper, and what you will do is lower prices. Well, under the system that had developed by the late 19th century, what John D. Rockefeller could do is take his 50% market share and his ton of cash that he had developed from that, having that market share, and say, you're going to sell kerosene for 95 cents a gallon? Guess what? I'm going to sell it for 30 cents a gallon for a couple of years until you are out of business. And then I'm going to buy your plant, use your techniques, and then jack the price up back to $1 a gallon. Yeah. And what many folks who were for the Antitrust Act in 1890 and then continued to press for a kind of vigorous prosecution of antitrust policy argued that that's necessary in order to keep competition alive in industrial capitalism, that you need a government intervention because the system had gotten so big and American businesses had gotten so big that basically it was kind of out of control.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking, like, what could you have done being the competitor to Rockefeller, right? Like, if you, like, you could wait it out or something like that, because you You could, yeah.
No, you couldn't. That was the whole point.
Right,
And he almost I mean, the reason why Rockefeller's a great example of this is because he's not a particularly charismatic individual. And Standard Oil is always depicted, if you see Standard Oil, it's always depicted as like an octopus, this horrible monster with arms everywhere. And he would say things like, I have ways of competing that you don't know about, you know?
Right.
And he would say things like...
intentionally was not, in my mind, I had this like cooperation mindset of capitalism. Like, if I cooperate with you, you win, I win. He's like, I'm going to crush you.
Yes.
But like, I'm going to make sure that you're not going to see the light of day and you're unable to compete
crush you
with
and
me.
Then buy your refinery pennies on the dollar, right? And they even developed, some of those folks, some of those wealthy, successful folks developed an ideology that justified that. They called it social Darwinism. They basically said they took this scientific theory of survival of the fittest, and they said the reason why I'm so wealthy and powerful and influential is because I'm obviously superior to other people. So. I mean, so when I teach American capitalism, what I try to do, because it's hard to define. A lot of people say capitalism, right?
Right. What do you mean?
And I say basically, look, it comes down to private property ownership, using a market, right, to allocate goods, because that's what economics is, right? It's basically the allocation of scarce goods across a wider population. It's why we call it the dismal science, right? Because basically what you're doing is you're saying, we're never going to have enough for everybody, so we got to ration it out, right? And in capitalism, you use a market economy to ration that out. And then the final thing is a profit motive, and all of those things create a kind of basic system of capitalism. But what we spend the entire semester doing, and what I'm still fascinated by after all these years, is how that actually develops in a society, right? Because it's one thing to use to look at Adam Smith and kind of create this nice, wonderful world where the invisible hand kind of magically provides everybody all of the things that they need. But we know that history is a lot sloppier than that, right? A lot messier than that. You have power differences, you have politics, you have all sorts of things that make that kind of simple system of capitalism, of free market capitalism, difficult sometimes to manage.
Yeah, and I want to explore both sides, right? I want to explore with you the power that it has to create well-being overall, like for individuals, like,
for sure,
as you said, pursuing their own self-interest to just make their lives better, and consequently making other people's lives better, right? Like, even if that was not the main objective.
Right.
So, and I also want to talk about like the negatives too, right? But maybe let's focus a bit first on the positive, right? Like you were talking about this explosion that happened with these big corporations, how they ended up growing from like maybe just like a small city to like everywhere and controlling millions in dollars and owning different types of business, as you said, like maybe steel and coal at the same time.
Right.
So how did that happen? And like, what were the innovations necessary to make that happen in terms of, for example, I had a couple of here, but definitely whatever else that you can think of. Like I was thinking like the restructuring of companies to account for like a managerial class or something like that, right? Like things like that. Like can you expand on that and like any others?
Happy to talk about business history. This is exciting for me. So what's really interesting about that, when you mentioned that, the kind of managerial class, is that so you have Adam Smith and his invisible hand, right? There was a historian, really, really famous business historian named Alfred Chandler, who wrote a book in the 1970s called The Visible Hand, which is a conscious push-off from Adam Smith's model. And what he argues is that if you look at the late 19th century, well, mid to late 19th century, what you see is the development of railroads, right? Now, most businesses in the early 19th century and before that were individual proprietorships. They're just, you run a business, right? You own the business. You might even hire a bunch of people, but you run it yourself.
A person,
yes. What you see in the period, particularly right around the time of the Civil War, 1850s and the 1860s and 1870s, is the rise of railroads. You cannot run a railroad yourself. They're way too expensive. Whereas the average business might be capitalized in hundreds or thousands of dollars, railroads are capitalized in millions of dollars. They are complex, right? You have rails, and of course, you're not double tracked the whole way. So you need to coordinate, because if you have a northbound train and a southbound train meeting at the same time, that's not going to be good, right? So you need pretty sophisticated communications. You need to know how much money you're making at any given moment, because they're so expensive. Railroads don't make money until they're completed, right? So you got to raise a lot of capital immediately. And the corporate form of enterprise is the perfect vehicle for that. Because it has certain things like limited liability, right? You're not personally responsible for the business. You're only responsible for the stock you pay in. Today, we take that as a given.
Right.
In the early 19th century, it was controversial, and that's why people would call corporations soulless monsters, because they said corporations can own land and all that, but they're not a person, right? They're not responsible for it. And so what Chandler argued, and I think that a lot of business historians have bought into this argument, is that what's really innovative about American capitalism, particularly American industrial capitalism, is the use of this corporate form of enterprise to create these big, complex organizations on a scale that had never been seen before. Right. They borrow actually the organizational kind of technique from the Army. They look at the Army and they say, like, you have to have a clear chain of command. You have to have a flow of information, right? The people fighting on the front line need to tell the general what they're doing at any given moment. And so actually early railroads say, we're going to use the kind of military organization of different levels of officers. Now they don't call them generals, they call them vice presidents and presidents. But what they do is they create these big complex organizations that can run a railroad. And then what Chandler says is it's a small leap to taking that kind of very efficient organization that can run a railroad well and applying it to other businesses. And so if you look at a lot of those late 19th century industries that blow up, a lot of them are using that corporate form of enterprise. They're using it because they can sell now stocks on this new fangled thing called a stock market, where you can sell shares of your company to the public and they will buy it. They're essentially investing in your firm. You can manage these huge amounts of money because it's not just you, right? With a ledger book, you've got a whole team of accountants that are doing it now. And they're all aimed towards that one essential element of industrial capitalism, the profit motive, right? And the way that late 19th century American businesses see as the most effective way to earn a profit is to control market share. But the problem is that creates real problems for a competitive economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking maybe, because you can think of it as, you can pose the problem as, of the market share that there is, let me increase the fraction as much as possible that I own. But you could also think of it as like, let me increase the total amount of market share there is, right? Let me find new customers, new innovations.
Yes, absolutely.
Like
that's entrepreneurship, right? Creative
right.
destruction, right? Finding new markets and so forth. Yeah.
What other types of innovations allowed all of this to happen, right? Like maybe you could, we already touched a little bit on the managerial structure, right? But like what made it all happens in terms of, maybe we could start talking a little bit about energy, right? Like what types of energy made it all happen, like so that companies, as you said, were able to do much more different things and an increased number of things, right? Like now, before you had like maybe like a couple of hundreds of people doing something, but now you have like tens of thousands of people with a really big structure, right? Like serving all of the country. Like how do you create something like that?
So right. I will argue that in addition to managerial capitalism, the kind of development of the modern industrial corporation, that the United States really, really benefits, and this is what my next book is going to be about, from abundant and cheap fossil fuel energy. And so now I'm going to start talking about coal. So, this is very exciting for me. If you look, for example, at early industrial ventures in the United States, they're textile mills in New England, and they draw on water power. And what that means is that you're limited, in where you can locate those factories. There has to be by a source of water, right, of running water, and preferably a source of water that's near a falls, a sudden drop in elevation in the river, because the water will be able to generate.
So you could tap it out easier,
you can tap into it,
higher pressure,
and you can run your machines, right? What fossil fuel does, what coal does, what the use of steam engines enables is the ability to plop those factories anywhere. So iron and steel is another great example. When you look at early iron industries in the colonial period of the United States in the early 19th century, they actually call them iron plantations because they were usually out way in the middle of a forest because you need charcoal for fuel and you need iron ore. So you would put them close to the iron ore and then you would have them be surrounded by forests so that you could chop down those forests and make charcoal. What coal allows you to do is put those iron and steel works really anywhere, preferably close to a source of coal. But with railroads, you have cheap transportation, so you can transport them there. So once you get the idea that the United States has this abundance of coal, and they did, the United States is very, very, very generously blessed with coal seams, both anthracite, which is harder form of coal, it's sometimes called stone coal. It's about 98% carbon, and bituminous, which is the more common type of coal. It's about 75% carbon. But both anthracite and bituminous coal are in abundance in the United States. In fact, one of the interesting things I think that policymakers say in the late 20th century is they call America the Saudi Arabia of coal, which is a kind of interesting kind of comment because you're basically saying coal is to the United States what oil is to Saudi Arabia. And I think it's that kind of abundance of coal that allows for this rapid industrialization because it basically means you have a cheap form of energy that can allow for the expansion of factories. You can allow for economies of scale because you don't have to worry about putting a factory next to a river and saying we can only dip a limited number of water wheels into this to saying we can add another steam engine, right? And double or triple the capacity of this factory, hire more people, reduce the per cost unit of production, undercut our competitors. So it's cheap energy, I think. First with coal and steam engines, then with electricity, beginning in the late 19th century, and then later on in the 20th century with oil. It's that fossil fuel energy system that I think makes America's industrial economy so dynamic.
Right, and I was thinking that plentifulness of coal allows for people to have to do the things that I was exactly referring to, right? Like being able to share like a more complicated network because you have now the resources to make it happen, right? Like for example, another innovation that I was thinking is like vertical integration, which you kind of just refer to it. Maybe you can expand a little bit on what exactly that means and how did that came to be. But yeah, the idea that now you can just do almost everything, right? Like now you have energy, and because you have energy, you can put, as you said, maybe the corporation that you had in the middle of the forest, you can put it in a city, you can hire more people, you can do all of these different complexities in a single place, kind of, right? Like, and have all of that efficiently communicating.
Right. You can create these systems that are, they're almost like, they're almost like little entities unto themselves. I'll give you an example drawn from the steel industry that I talk about a lot, which is Carnegie Steel, which is kind of weird because I've just been talking about industrial corporations, and Carnegie Steel actually wasn't a corporation. It was a limited partnership because Andrew Carnegie didn't want to have stockholders. He wanted so much control. One of his big slogans.
The guy.
Yeah, one of his big slogans. I mean, he hired a lot of managers, but he never incorporated. And his big slogan was, "Put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket." Right? So what Carnegie did though was he needed when he was really making high quality steel in Pittsburgh, beginning in the 1870s, and then really hit his kind of stride in the 1880s and 1890s. He needed good quality coking coal. Now, what coking coal is it's bituminous coal that you put into an oven and basically bake it. And when you bake it, the impurities come out of that coal, and it's like a honeycomb structure. And because there's oxygen kind of in with the coal, it burns really hot. It's great for steel making, right? Now, a lot of that is located in southwestern Pennsylvania, just down the road from Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh area, where Carnegie Steel's operating. That coal had been kind of consolidated under the control of a guy named Henry Clay Frick. I don't know if that name rings a bell. There's like a Frick Museum in New York. All these people become fabulously wealthy and their houses become museums.
Because I saw like TV shows like The Men Who Built America.
Yes, he would be in there,
Right.
really tough guy, had broken the back of all the unions in the coking fields of southwestern Pennsylvania. Now, here's again where being a price maker, not a price taker, is important. Carnegie could buy his coal from Frick, but he didn't want to be dependent on the market in that way, right? Because he knew that Frick had him over a barrel, right? Frick could say, I'm going to sell coal to you for $8 a ton, not $4 a ton. I might sell it to somebody else for $4 a ton, but I know you need a ton of it, so I'm going to jack the price up.
Which, so what I'm thinking now is like parallels in the government scale, right? Like let's not depend on China, that they have like all of our manufacturing supplies.
Yeah. So what you want to do is avoid being dependent upon these forces outside of your control for things like basic supplies. So that's the theory behind vertical integration. Is you integrate vertically, and what you do is you say, we're going to buy iron mines in Minnesota rather than buying it from iron mining companies. We're going to let Frick, he makes Frick a partner in Carnegie Steel. Not necessarily because he liked Henry Clay Frick. I don't think anyone liked Henry Clay Frick. He was a really disagreeable guy. Whereas Carnegie liked to portray himself as a friend of the working man and this kind of affable kind of chap. Frick was not that. But he brings him in as a partner so that he can get his supply of coke. Gotcha. I always say that, and then the laugh, and I say not coke like cocaine, coke like coking coal. That's another example of vertical integration, because you're moving down and acquiring iron ore, you're acquiring coal, and now Carnegie Steel controls all of that. So they don't have to worry about the market price for iron ore, the market price for coal. Now, one could argue again, the people that are suffering for that are the iron miners in Minnesota, the iron mining companies in Minnesota, who are now bought out by Carnegie Steel, right? Okay. They're no longer independent entities. There's maybe limited opportunities in the iron fields for folks who want to develop their own iron mining company because they're now dealing with this behemoth called Carnegie Steel. Right. And coal mining companies down in southwestern Pennsylvania, because now they're finding it harder to compete because now Carnegie Steel is controlling most of that industry. So you get this consolidation under vertical integration, and it's all aimed at increasing market share and relentless cutting costs. You can say the benefit to society is Carnegie Steel is even cheaper. I mean, if you look at the era of big business, the big trend in that era from the 1860s up through, say, the 1910s is one of the most deflationary periods in American history. In other words, prices go down. Going down, right? Yeah, right. And that's big business. Now, what I always tell my students is look at the positives and negatives, the winners and losers, right? The benefits to that are lower prices. The negatives to that are these massive industrial corporations. And you've probably seen all the cartoons about the big trusts with the kind of diamond stick pins and so forth. And so you have these massive concentrations of wealth and power. The question is that good for society or is it bad? It turned into this debate to where beginning in the 1930s, there were two kind of competing schools. This guy named Matthew Josephson wrote a book called The Robber Barons, and that's where we get that term from. And he argued essentially that's what Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan were. They were robber barons. They were basically holding up American society to make money, right? And then another kind of competing field called them. No, they're industrial statesmen. Right? They are the example of the potential of the American industrial economy. You yourself could become a Rockefeller or Carnegie one day if you have the talent and the perseverance and so forth. So, those two sides of it. Now that's a kind of a false dichotomy. And it's a simplistic way to look at it. But I think it's important that we always look at the kind of trade-offs. And I'll use another example from coal, drawn from coal, that I talk about in my book. There's a guy who I feature in a journalist by the name of Charles Barnard. And he's looking for a story idea. And he's in his house in Boston. And he looks at his coal fire and he says, I wonder where that coal comes from. And so he basically does this long story.
And when was this again?
This was in the 1880s.
Okay. Yeah. Not recently.
No, not recently. Although I have a good parallel to that. But in the 1880s, I think it's 1889, but I could be wrong. He basically he calls his story from hod to mine, right? So he wonders, how does the coal get to my coal hod, the carrier, and into my fireplace? And he says, I got to go back. So he goes to his coal dealer and he says, where do you get your coal from? And the guy says, I get it from this large company. He goes and visits this company and he's describing it the whole way. He's like, there's these railroads, these massive kind of railroad networks that distribute the coal to the coal dealer. And then he goes to the coal country and he follows a canal all the way upstream. And he goes to the coal mine and he gets to see the coal miners at work and the breaker boys up top who are sorting the coal, who are 14 and 15 years old. They're not going to school. They're working in a coal mine. And he basically concludes that there are these thousands of people who are all dedicated to getting that coal from the mine to me.
That guy, right.
And then he says, like, but what are the costs of that? He's like, I see these breaker boys and these kids are like dead inside. You know, they're working 10-hour shifts, 12-hour shifts, literally perched over a conveyor belt, picking out rock from the coal that's streaming by. And so it's a really interesting article. And basically what he says is this is the price that we pay for kind of modern conveniences. Somebody actually did this recently with gasoline.
Okay.
She's a journalist. She's pumping gas in her car. He's like, I wonder where this gasoline comes from. Right. And in that case, it was a late 20th century story. And she goes, to the refinery and sees how refineries work, and then goes to the country where the crude oil eventually comes from and sees the kind of environmental costs and says, this is the price we pay. So when I teach my global history of energy class, the first thing I say the first day is, energy is something we take for granted. We walk into a room, we pop the switch on and the light comes on. And we don't think about where that energy comes from, right? Yeah. We don't think about the people that are mining the coal to generate the electricity, the linemen that are out there making sure that the lines don't collapse. There are these whole industrial systems that are at work to do one thing, to make modern life convenient. And there's always going to be trade-offs for that.
And you could say that, like, as you are getting that electricity or as you're getting that coal into your house, that it's a convenience to you. It's also, you could say that it's a convenience for the guy that it's mounting the pole, the electricity poles, to get that money to get their own conveniences, right? Like that, for example, I was thinking maybe that's a little bit more harder to think about, like more controversial, I guess. Like of those kids that were in Minnesota, picking up coal in Pennsylvania, sorry, like doing whatever with the coal. What would have happened if they did not, if they were not doing that, right? Like what would have been the alternative? Like were they getting paid somehow? And if they're getting paid, would they have gotten a better pay otherwise, right? Like I don't know, right? Like it's
that's a difficult question, right? At that point, I'm able to say that's a counterfactual, and I'm a historian.
I don't know if you look at factuals,
right? But there's an interesting point in that in industrialization, because sometimes you describe these systems and you're like, why would anyone go along with this? Why would anyone work in a coal mine? Why would anyone go to a city and get a job in a factory? And it makes me think of this book that I reviewed, where an economist did this really interesting study where. We don't have a lot of height and weight data from the 19th century. They just didn't do that. But when they did do that is when you got drafted in the army. And so he took these Civil War soldier rolls and he determined height and weight, right? And that's generally a marker of good health, right? Good dietary health and so forth.
Like a BMI.
Right. And what he did was he compared where they were from, because these rolls would have very limited data, but they would have height, weight, where you were from. And he looked at the rural counties and he looked at the urban counties, right? The industrialized counties and the rural counties. And he said, the rural counties, there was a clear pattern where those people were taller, they weighed more, they were generally healthier. And so he said, he concluded life was better for them. But when I reviewed that book, I said, no, there's actually, during the entire 19th century, there is a net migration of people from the country to the city. Why are people moving there when demonstrably life is maybe shorter and a little more brutal? It's for the reason you mentioned. It's money. It's an attraction factor. Industrial life and urban life is a lot more exciting than rural life, right? You have a lot more modern conveniences. You have a lot more abilities for opportunities for entertainment. You meet more people. You're around people. Again, it's a trade-off, right? I mean, your health might decline because you're breathing in this smoke all the time, and you're working in a factory, and that can be debilitating work. But still, most Americans preferred that to living and working on a farm in the 19th century. And so that's something I get students to think about too, are those kinds of trade-offs that we always make, right? In our lives,
right? Like what is important to you, and like,
right.
And ideally, how I think about it is, capitalism allows you to make those trade-offs, right?
It does, yes.
Allows you to give you the decision, right? Like, do you want to be in the forest and not have cell phones and not, right, like live from your own land and then be chill there? Or do you want to go to the city and go to like a axe throwing fair and you have your iPhone and you invite your friends and then you go to the disco party, right? But then maybe you have to work longer, or like you have to sit on a desk that maybe you don't like, or things like that. Like, that's how at least I think about it, right? Like, it allows you to make those decisions, and it allows you to make that determination of what is the priority for myself.
It's choice.
Right.
It's I mean, and by the late 20th century, what American industrial capitalism has created are these incredibly high standards of living with a lot of consumer choice.
Right.
You know, you can go to the grocery store and choose 15 types of breakfast cereal, right? I was asked once. I did a panel, and it was a question that kind of caught me off guard. And the panelist at the end said, "Sean, will you sell capitalism as a system? What would you do to sell that?" And I thought, oh my gosh. And the thing I came up with at first was like, well, if you like individual freedom and choice, then capitalism is for you, right? Now again, that doesn't mean that everybody has the same range of choices, and that doesn't mean that everybody can purchase the same products and so forth.
Right.
But in terms of other systems where you have limited choices or no choice at all, that's the selling point of capitalism. I think that's why that system tends to win out when it's in competition with other systems. It's why I think the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because of these wide geopolitical factors, but ultimately I think the Soviet Union collapsed because it could not provide the high standards of living and consumer choices for its citizens. Soviets, once they started looking at the world outside the Soviet Union and saw that you can buy blue jeans and you can listen to music,
it's like
you want
the
to.
perfect example is like the West and East Germany, right? Like
right.
What was the flow of people? Were people going from west to east?
Exactly. That's why I think that the system wins. It's not, I mean, and obviously there are inequalities involved, right? And as we've been talking about, there are trade-offs involved. I sound like I'm so enthusiastic about the fossil fuel industry, but the one thing I always have to kind of caution people against is there are environmental factors to that too, right? You look at an American city or a British city where they're burning coal, and it is dark and sooty, and folks tried to come up with all sorts of excuses. For example, they said coal smoke is antiseptic. Well, okay, there are a lot of things that are antiseptic, but that doesn't mean you have to breathe it in. In the UK, for example, the coal smoke was so dense that it actually changed it changed nature, in that there were these moths, white moths and brown moths, right? Yeah. And the white moths stood out because they were always landing on these sooty kind of surfaces, and so the birds just picked them off really easily. Right. So eventually the brown moths began to evolve. And my father grew up in Pittsburgh in the 1940s, and he said he can remember, because he went to Catholic school and you had to have a white shirt on all the time. And he would have to go home at lunch and change because his shirt would be brown by midday. And there were days in Pittsburgh in the 1940s where you could never see the sun. And it wasn't because it was cloudy out. It was because there was so much coal smoke in the air. And that's another trade-off, right? I mean, are we willing to kind of tolerate those environmental conditions for a lot of those modern conveniences? What I found in my research is that throughout most of the 19th century, at least, Americans were like, absolutely. Nature is something to be tamed. That's why they use the word internal improvements, right? We're improving on nature.
Right. And you can make the case, right, like that, okay, then if that is a problem, then a solution is, okay, build the corporation that solves that problem for a profit, right? Like somehow charge whoever is willing to pay to remove that soot from the air or something like that, right? If that's even possible. So you could there's pros and cons in there, but let me stay a little bit more on the 19th century, on the energy aspect that you're saying, right? Like, take me a little bit more specifically to the history that you go through in your book. What was the impact? Like, who are these people that wanted to heat their homes, and how were they able to do it more efficiently? And they maybe go a little bit more personal, because I was thinking like, okay, I think I read in one of your articles, I'm forgetting which one, that there was a specific 1880s, I think, blizzard in New York.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
that it was like
blizzard.
stupidly cold that people were like completely sure into this. Like, what happened in there, right? Like, what were the stories of the different people living in that situation, and how did that came to be? Yeah.
So the premise of the book, it starts with an energy crisis, right? Mm-hmm. When most Americans think about an energy crisis, they think about the energy crisis of the 1970s. And I talk about the energy crisis of the 1770s and 1780s, in that basically it's before the United States, well, it was before the United States existed in the 1760s and 1770s, but they did not know that they had these vast quantities of coal, and they burned wood. Now, wood is really easy to burn. It's a stable technology. Humans have been burning wood for thousands of years by that time. But what starts to happen is, as cities grow, the stocks of wood disappear. Because of two things. First of all, the United States around the turn of the 19th century is still very, very agricultural. So you're clearing land. Mm-hmm. The one thing that we would have found very different about the landscape, if you went, say, for example, to Pennsylvania or Virginia in the 1780s or 1790s, is how when you were in any area of population, there wouldn't have been that many trees, because all that land had been cleared for farmland, right? And what the farmers would do is they would clear land, and then they would sell that firewood at market. Well, by the 1780s and 1790s, in cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, you start to run out of firewood, or firewood becomes prohibitively expensive, to the point where when you have a cold winter, for example, the winter of 1780 was a notoriously cold winter. Okay. They started chopping down ornamental trees and burning them. Folks started burning furniture. They just ran out of firewood. And so what they start to do, to make a long story short, is replacing wood with coal. And what I argue is that creates a whole new incentive for things like coal burning stoves, which creates an incentive for iron and steel. But essentially what coal does in American cities is it allows them to grow, because you're no longer worried about freezing to death in your own house during the winter, right?
Yeah, I think a good way
facilitates modern life.
A good way that you put it in one of your writings is that it was easier to live through winter without preparation. Yeah. Right? Like that there's even like places in here that, like in New York, right? Like people don't prepare for the winter anymore, right? No. Like, which was the case in like maybe a couple of 100 years ago, that it was like you had to gather resources, you had to get your wood, you have to somehow store that wood in your house, right?
That's the other thing too, is think about storing it, right? I mean, you know, the other thing about the kind of, I call it the industrial hearth, but the idea that you have these coal distribution networks where all this coal is flowing into the cities, it's going to the coal dealers, and then it's going to the people who purchase the coal. It's a early version of what they call just-in-time inventory, right? I mean, you cannot store the amount of wood that you need to keep your house warm in an urban lot. I mean, you would just you would just be sitting on piles of firewood. Right. And so what you start to see is, for example, coal cellars. If you go to an American house that was built in the 1880s or 1890s, they would have a massive cellar, and that was for storing your coal. Essentially, it was a storage tank for coal. But what that means is you buy coal once, you have the dealer come, shovel it into your coal cellar, and then you don't have to worry about it for the rest of the time. And what you're not doing is spending all your time shivering. Right? And thinking about where you're going to get your coal from. Now, that creates other problems in that basically poor people, for example, could not afford to purchase their coal for the whole season. They just didn't have that money. So they had to buy it like a piece at a time. Right. The analogy I use is, think about people who go to Costco and you buy like these massive amounts of supplies and you pay a cheaper price and it keeps you for a while, as to imagine doing all your shopping at like a 7-Eleven. Or a convenience store, right? The prices are way higher there. And that's what grocers would do. They would sell coal by the lump, but it was way more expensive than buying it by the ton. So there are inequalities in that system too. But what coal does is it allows cities essentially to grow without worrying about how are we going to keep people warm? How are we going to, survive these blizzards and this cold weather? Now, for that reason, it's largely a northern phenomenon. But I argued it's when Americans became addicted to fossil fuel. right? Famously, George Bush said in 2006, I think, Americans are addicted to oil, right? And all of a sudden, well, it's not all of a sudden, but we had known that we need to kind of maybe wean ourselves from fossil fuel. And part of the motivation for me to write this book was people were saying, oh, we became addicted to oil because Americans love cars and, gasoline comes from oil, and that's when we became addicted. And I said, no, I think coal. Usually for me, the answer is coal. And I thought, no, it's coal. And it's home heating. Because if you look at the late 19th century, one of the biggest fears of urban residents were coal strikes disrupting the supply of coal. It's why in 1902, when there's a massive strike in the anthracite fields of Pennsylvania, President Teddy Roosevelt is able to do something that no president had been able to do before. He basically says, we're not going to side with capital versus labor, but we do need to keep this coal running. So what I'm going to do is this unprecedented thing of setting up a coal commission and negotiating, using the federal government to negotiate between labor and capital. So coal literally changed the ways in which the federal government related to the labor capital divide. And the reason I think that's really, really fascinating is if you really push back or pull back and figure out what's behind that, it's this consumer demand for coal. It's the fear that we might have to survive a winter without coal. And so that's why I argued that Americans were addicted to it. Maybe not in a kind of necrotic way or a bad way, but it's certainly when they became dependent upon fossil fuels. And then it was very easy for Americans to take that kind of assumption that we have these abundant sources of energy on demand from a coal regime into an oil regime, where we just assume that there's unlimited amounts of oil out there.
What were the alternatives back then for the coal? And like, did they play out? Right. Like, for example, one of the ones that I was thinking when you mentioned oil is steam, right? That could have been an alternative, but that it just didn't make sense, right?
Steam's generated by coal during that period.
Okay,
so, by and large,
you're completely,
so you're
right,
burning. I mean, you can't burn wood. So what I always like to do is look at it in terms of regimes, and those regimes sometimes coexist, right? So firewood, and this is something that it was a critique of my kind of argument that coal was so important in the 1830s, and some folks will say, well, if you look at from a statistical sense, coal only surpasses wood in the total amount burnt in the United States. It's an estimate, but we estimate in the 1880s, right? And so why is Adams talking about how important coal is in the 1830s and 1840s? Okay. And I would say, well, I mean, it's uneven, right? I mean, they're burning a lot of coal in American cities. And yes, there are these kind of parallel regimes of coal and wood. Right? I mean, I can talk about the age of coal, but that doesn't mean everybody just stopped using firewood. I mean, people use firewood even today. And oil, for example, does not surpass coal in the amount used to generate energy until the 1940s. Right. But that's not to say oil and gasoline wasn't important in the 1930s, right? I mean, so the alternatives were firewood, which was expensive, which still people used. For example, if you look at across the South, people are still burning firewood because, number one, the winters aren't particularly cold. And number two, the population is pretty dispersed across the countryside. So you still have those stocks of wood. But maybe
there's not the infrastructure to get coal everywhere, right? Like you have wood next door, but you don't have I guess now you do, right? Like, but maybe in the 20th century, it was difficult to get coal or something like that.
Well, they would ship it down. Actually, they would burn. They had coal burning stoves in the South. They would just ship the coal, usually from the South or from the northern coal mines. Yeah. So and then there were alternatives in the late 19th century. I think this is kind of interesting, but for a while, the oil producers, which really start in earnest in the 1860s, right, is when they start distilling oil to make kerosene. And kerosene is used as an illuminating fuel. But when you distill oil, when you refine it, it creates a number of products, right? So it creates. So now we call them the kind of the towers, right? At a certain level, these different materials kind of suss out, right? So there's asphalt in the bottom, and that's what we use to line roads and stuff. And there's kerosene, there's lubricating oil, and then there's gasoline, right? Which is relatively light, very, very flammable. Yeah. Right. And so for a while they tried gasoline heaters. Those did not work well, as you can imagine. So
because like the dangerous aspect.
Yeah, incredibly dangerous and flammable and hard to manage. But so the alternatives were, yes, steam heat was an alternative. Hot air furnaces were an alternative, still based on coal, but not the direct heat generated by coal. Do you see what I mean? So you're not getting your heat from a coal stove directly. You're getting it from a furnace, which is usually built under your house, but you're still feeding that furnace coal.
Right.
And then in the early 20th century, you start to get electric heaters.
Right.
But that electricity was largely generated by coal. Yeah. Now, what they're doing is they're removing the center of heat production from your close proximity to a more remote location. So what you're getting is this instance in which you were less kind of present at the creation of that heat energy. And so it becomes more abstract. And that's why I always tell my students, like, that's why when you flip a switch, you don't think about, you don't have to worry about making the electricity, right? If we had to, for example, hang out a solar panel, right? Or pedal, and, charge a battery or something, we would think a lot about using energy, right? We'd be like, I don't know if if watching TV is worth 2 hours on the treadmill, So what it does is it removes that idea of kind of generating heat from kind of the immediate proximity of it. Makes it more abstract.
You're kind of answering it, but what is your motivation for studying energy specifically, right? Like, I guess it's kind of like this question is like, you could argue that kind of everything revolves back to energy, right? You need energy to do anything, right? So like, where does that come from, and like, how does that distribute it? Like
personally?
Yeah.
This is a really interesting story. So I was not all that interested in studying coal when I became a professional historian.
Okay.
When I went to graduate school. I wanted to study immigration. My parents came from immigrant families, so I wanted to study immigration and nativism and the early 20th century. But when I look back on it, I was kind of born to do this. I was born in Carbondale, Illinois. My dad taught at Southern Illinois University. And then at a young age, we moved to West Virginia, Morgantown, West Virginia, where when, we would have snow days where they would cancel school because of snow. And they would announce the schools, and they would also announce mine closings. Okay. I thought that was normal. I was like, Delsla number 6 is closed. And so, and if you know West Virginia at all, I mean, coal is just steeped in the culture there. So I wasn't really all that interested. And then I came across my dissertation topic. Like I said, I was interested in figuring out what the difference between slave and free states were in terms of industrialization. And I happened upon coal. And so, as often happens with historians, you'll hear this. You start studying something and you kind of get into it. And then you finish your first book. And then you think, I should come up with another book. And it's like, what do I know a lot about? I know a lot about coal, and I did a lot of research on coal. But more seriously, I also began to look at how it underwrites so much of society, and particularly industrial society. And so, I think I said at the beginning, what fascinates me is industrialization. That people, had lived in a certain way for thousands of years, right? Thousands of years. I mean, if you looked at daily life in the 1400s and daily life in the Roman Empire,
not all that different.
Yeah, I mean, the clothes are different, and the languages are different, and all that kind of stuff. The material conditions that are not all that different. Then look at what happens over the course of 100 years, right? Like look at the United States from like living in 1815 to living in 1915. You've got cars, you've got planes, you've got all this stuff. And industrialization is what made that happen. And so that's what I find it so fascinating is that it happened so quickly and it had such a dynamic impact. And what I thought was, this is all derivative of fossil fuels. And I think that I also got in with a bunch of like-minded historians who were studying energy, and we all started saying the same thing, is that, a lot of modern life would have been just absolutely impossible because we would have spent all our time getting firewood, right? I mean, there's no way that the UK, for example, would have been able to grow and have the kind of population it did if it didn't have coal. The one historian calls it the subterranean forest or ghost acres, because basically you don't have to worry about firewood anymore and growing these huge stocks of wood. You can just simply burn coal. Now, again, that has disadvantages to it, obviously. But so that's kind of why I got into it. Was there's a little bit of that with everything, I mean, if you study politics, you think everything is politics, right? If you study free market economics, it's like, well, that can be explained by the free market. And for me, it's energy, right? Energy is at the heart of all this. Right. But yeah, no, I can't believe it, but I'm still fascinated by this stuff, by fossil fuel production and consumption years after I started studying it.
Right. And it just a quick, confirmation, I guess, that fossil fuels is like coal, oil, petroleum, like all of those, just because they were originated with carbon, like with organic matter,
materials. Yeah, right? They are.
Which, like, the misconception is like dinosaurs.
They're liquid sunshine. Yeah,
right. But it was like
oil is liquid sunshine. Yeah. So what happens is you get these mostly one-celled organisms die. Right, and plant life dies. Right. I mean, there are dinosaurs, and in fact,
and like this is millions of years ago.
Yeah, billions, billions of years ago. And what happens is so all these plants die, gets covered over by sediment, and then it kind of crunches down, and the carbon in that, the sunlight, right, the photosynthesis converts sunlight into energy. Right. That energy is kind of retained, right? To the point where there are animals in there too, because one of the things that early coal miners would often find in the coal is they would find skeletons, right? They would find fossils in the coal, and they would wonder how that happened and stuff like that. In fact, I went to one conference that got really groovy where a person was saying, every time you burn coal or oil, you're hearing the screams of ghosts of former living beings, and I was like, I don't know if that works, but yeah, I mean that's essentially what it is. And because it's a fossil fuel, it's limited, and there's this big debate about oil, mostly more than coal, it's called the peak oil debate. When are we going to run out? Right? Because it's a limited amount. There are only so many organisms that lived during that time in Earth's history, and eventually we're going to run out. Now, with innovations in fracking and shale oil and so forth, we've kind of bought a lot of time. But there was a famous geologist who made the argument that in the 1970s we've hit peak oil. Right? There's less oil remaining in the earth than there was when we first started drilling for it.
Right, like peak oil is like 50% of the 100%. We reach 50%.
Downward slope.
Right.
But what fracking and shale oil does is it keeps moving that.
Right. Maybe you could talk about it a little bit like that, because you had discussions yourself. Like, for example, I listened to the roundtable that your Inquiry of Capitalism program did with like energy.
Oh yeah. The future of I think the history of fossil fuels.
Yeah. It was very interesting, right? Like, maybe can you touch a little bit on that, because those questions definitely did not come to my mind before listening to these things, like what fracking even was, and like how that impacted all of this, and like these questions of like, because these are very interesting questions that I didn't really ask before, that it's not only like a matter of scientific curiosity, right? Like, these questions guide this industrial decision making, right? Like, and governmental policy, right? Like, if we are really in the peak of energy consumptions, then should we maybe like start slowing down that, right?
Yeah.
And like,
So that's a really interesting question, because from a 19th century industrial mindset, these things generally are considered to be super abundant, right? And we don't think about conservation. However, in the UK, there was a writer by the name of William Jevons who wrote a book called The Coal Question, and he basically said, at some point, we're going to run out of coal, and we got to think about that. Now, what ends up happening is everyone ends up screaming like, he's just being hysterical, whatever. And that was the same thing that happened with Hubbert's peak when he wrote that piece in the 1960s and said at some point in the 1970s, we were going to hit peak oil. When you have a system that's based on fossil fuel abundance and just being awash in all of this energy, the last thing you think about is conservation and scarcity. And what happened in the United States was in 1973, when for political reasons, OPEC, the Arab nations of OPEC, put an embargo, and all of a sudden the United States didn't have abundant supplies of fossil fuel. They started thinking about scarcity, and it was a real reason we call it the oil shock. Was it came as a shock because there just had always been oil and fossil fuels. when the United States becomes a net importer of oil, in other words, we don't have enough oil to satisfy our own needs in 1949, right? And we just import the oil from places, from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Saudi Arabia. And then when that oil gets shut off, all of a sudden we're dealing with, oh my gosh, scarcity, conservation. So you have things like, for example, President Jimmy Carter wearing a cardigan and talking about how you should turn your thermostat down. That was inconceivable to most Americans.
Energy.
Yeah, conserve energy. What are you talking about? Gas would hit the unseemly price of $1 per gallon.
Right.
And it was rationed. I can remember as a little kid sitting in the back of my dad's station wagon while we waited in lines for gas.
Right.
And you could only go if your license plate ended in an odd or even number and go get gas. That did come as a shock. And all of a sudden, we started thinking about alternatives like solar energy, nuclear energy, non-fossil fuel sources of energy.
And this is not even thinking about climate change, right? Like
this is even before climate change.
Like, this is like a completely different question.
This is before folks were really concerned about the impact of greenhouse gases and climate change.
What I normally
which I think that's what most people
nowadays.
When they would say, why shouldn't we use fossil fuels? It's not a scarcity question because what ends up happening is those high prices of oil. This again is capitalism at work, right? It creates an incentive for companies to say, well, it used to be that we just kind of stuck this straw in the ground and sucked up all the oil. We think there's some oil left in there, right? We think there's oil in this material called shale, right? But it was too expensive and we didn't really have the technical know-how to extract it. Well, when oil prices go up, all of a sudden there are those incentives, right? And so they came up with fracking, which is this incredibly interesting idea of kind of drilling horizontally, and they use a proprietary fluid to kind of release the gas in the oil. Oil shale refining, which is taking the shale rock and kind of converting that into oil. And what's really interesting is shale and fracking have price points somewhere between $30 and $70 a barrel. So when oil goes under $30 a barrel, and we'll do that occasionally when there's a huge glut. It's all of a sudden inefficient to frack or to shale, and those operations will shut down. But when oil goes up, in some cases, right now it's around $60 a barrel.
Well, boys, let's go again.
Then they can do it. And what that has done is it's pushed peak oil, really, really far back in time. So it's not, but you're right in that fossil fuels certainly have a well-deserved bad reputation, but not so much because there's not enough of them, but mostly because we consider it pretty bad for the environment. I'll give you another example. There's this material called methane hydrate that's really interesting. It is also a fossil fuel, and what it is it's basically in the ocean. When one-celled organisms and plankton and stuff die, they settle down to the bottom, right? And there's a sweet spot where they will get trapped in terms of atmospheric pressure and temperature. And what it is it's basically methane snow. It's like methane that's produced from the decay of organic beings. And so it stays there because it's basically got a lid on it, right? The ocean, really, really low depths. If you bring it up to the surface, it looks like snow, but you can light it on fire because it's pure methane. And there is, I don't want to say unlimited, but there is a lot of methane hydrate. I mean, it's all over the oceans, mostly in the coastal areas. The only impediment to that is actually the technological cost of raising it because it's way down deep. The Japanese have invested a lot of money in methane hydrate extraction because, of course, they don't have any really substantive reserves of fossil fuels. In fact, that's why.
And they have plenty of access to
they have plenty of access to oceans, and there's a lot of methane hydrate there. And so there is some speculation that should we continue to need fossil fuel, and even if we ran out of oil, there's all this methane hydrate. And so I think that the most optimistic version of that is that's a bridge loan, right? Until we can figure out, say, nuclear fusion or something like that. Or refine solar so that it's so cheap that we use solar for everything. But, what we're finding is that scarcity question that we thought was important in the 1970s is really not that important anymore. Now it's more a question of, are we going to, bake ourselves to death by burning all this
right,
fossil fuel
right,
and releasing it into
right.
the atmosphere?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because now, before the last sentence, it was like, okay, that's the beauty of capitalism and work, right?
Yeah, I know.
That in a sense is like, it's not a matter of like, okay, let's stop using oil, or like let's stop turning down the heat.
Right.
Right. It's more like, let's figure out ways of like continue our prosperity, right? Like continue ways so that we can, if we want to turn the heat on as much as we want, that we can. Right. Let's just drill into the water and like let's find let's find this new material that can give us the same resources that we have, but we have a technical challenge, right? Like, so let's solve it, right? Like,
right.
That's the beauty of it. What I would argue after the last sentence is now it's just the same problem, but in different time scales, right? So like the same optimization problem is like, okay, how do we figure out what is best for us, but maybe not in this specific moment, but in this specific moment and in the future, like in 10 years, right? Like in 20 years, 100 years, if we care about like what our children will be at the very least, or something like that. Like, would you agree with that assessment? Like, how do you think about, and maybe we can just pivot it to the conversation of, because once you mention climate change, I think necessarily you invite a question or like a discussion on government intervention, right? So, yeah, like how does that look like for you, right? Like those types of questions and that type of thinking, and because I wanted to now dig into a little bit of like, okay, as you said, maybe people finding their own ways of living, like figuring out making their own businesses, making their own decisions. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe we need like some other entity to regulate what's going on,
or creating or the flip side of that is creating incentives to do
creating
that, right?
creating different incentives.
So because there's one, so they tried, for example, at the height of fossil fuel use in the 1950s and 1960s, when the pollution was just getting out of control. And as early as the early 20th century, when smoke was a problem, they had these smoke abatement movements, right, to get rid of smoke. And it wasn't even because of climate change. It was a nuisance, right? I mean, it was just gotten everywhere, and everything stunk, and everything was smoky. And what they found is just passing regulations against that were really difficult. Companies would find ways around it and so forth. And so what they came up with are these ideas of, carbon emission permits. I don't know if you know about that. So the idea is you basically purchase the rights to pollute, which sounds incredibly obnoxious to us, right? You're allowing companies to purchase the rights to pollute. But the argument is that if you create an incentive and make it expensive for them to pollute, but you allow them to do it, you're not shutting them down. You're not giving them incentive to cheat. You're basically saying, look, this is an expense. It's no longer what economists call an externality. It's now an expense that you have to manage. And so you will innovate and find ways of doing that. I'm the son of an economist. So from a very young age, I can remember the 1970s when we were learning all about conservation. I came home and I was all upset. And I said, we're going to run out. My teacher said we're going to run out of oil, and, this is going to happen. And my father said, what will happen is there'll be an incentive to create, more efficient electric cars, and we'll just go on electric cars. And I was like, oh, okay. And I brought that to my teacher, and my teacher yelled at me. It was, you're not taking the unit seriously. But I believe that, you can create incentives for that. I mean, one of the things the other thing to keep in mind with this is the infrastructure, and I talk about this in my book about coal, the infrastructure that needs to develop to, for example, deliver cheap coal from the mine to cities takes decades and millions of dollars to develop. The infrastructure that we built to allow people to drive from one point, virtually any point in the United States, to another point, get gas along the way, get car repairs along the way, all that stuff took decades and millions of dollars. the idea that we can just simply kind of say, you know what, let's stop using fossil fuels. It's really bad for us.
Right.
That's going to be very, very difficult. And it's one thing that I find really depressing whenever I speak to kind of public audiences, and inevitably somebody will ask, why don't we just use solar power? You know, the sun comes down.
Right.
And I bring that up and I say, look, I hope that we can start using alternative energy sources. I really do. But we are pretty hardwired into this fossil fuel economy. Right. And until, I think, this is my opinion, until we create incentives for people to produce this cheaply and efficiently, we're going to remain wedded to that system, regardless of what governments try to do. You know, a great example of that is the electric car, right? And the reason why Elon Musk, before he became a kind of political figure and was still kind of mainly an entrepreneur, not only was he interested in electric cars, but he was interested in these huge batteries, because the future challenge for energy is not the generation of energy, because we can use solar, we can use hydroelectric, we can use nuclear.
The storage.
It's the storage, right? Here's what fossil fuel does that's really, really amazing. Yeah. By amazing, I mean significant, not great in a positive way. But what fossil fuel does is it allows for long-term storage and immediate use.
Right.
When you have a tank of gas in your car, you don't have to worry about, storage problems.
Yeah.
You just start it up and it starts up.
Yeah, I always think of like the generators that you can buy, right? Like you just put gasoline in there, and if your power goes out, just fire it up. The generator.
Fossil fuel is ready to work for you when you're ready for it to work for you. But solar and wind and all that stuff, sometimes the sun shines too much. Sometimes the wind blows too much. Sometimes it doesn't shine at all. And sometimes the wind doesn't blow. You got to find some way to kind of level that out. And so that's why, storage is the big, big issue.
Yeah.
And we're at such a rudimentary level of it now. I mean, there are batteries, yes, and battery technology. There are big incentives now to improve battery technology. But a lot of what they do is stuff like using energy to pump water up a hill, right? Keep it there in a reservoir.
Right.
And then when the solar energy is low, you release that water and it comes down and spins the turbine.
If it works.
That's prehistoric technology, right? So I think if you want the idea that's going to make you a gajillionaire, it's invent a cheap battery that doesn't draw on things like rare earths, because that's the other thing that we're finding, right?
How to make the battery.
Making the battery, it creates these needs for materials like nickel, and it causes the same. If part of the geopolitical issue of fossil fuels is we don't determine where oil is from, and it can be from these incredibly volatile places, right? And what it means is that countries get involved with other countries that they shouldn't be involved in, right? And it allows for corrupt regimes to continue to exist because they're wealthy from oil wealth. If that's the problem, battery technology as it stands is just simply shifting those problems to other countries, right? To the countries that produce nickel, or rare earth, or lithium, it obviously, I'm not of the mindset that history repeats itself, but it does rhyme, right? And so, those same problems that we have will be repeated. So if you really, really, really want to make a lot of money, this is my message to everyone. Find out how to make a battery out of like sand or something like that. Something that is cheap, abundant. You can do it anywhere. And once we do that, then we're going to save a ton of money, and a ton of headaches.
I wanted to ask you on that question that we've already been talking about it a little bit. Maybe let's talk about it in a historical perspective. The question of incentives, the question of who makes them, the question of regulation. What was the role of government in the 19th century while all of these crazy things were happening, right? Like we've talked a little bit about the Gilded Age. We've talked about a little bit about like the coal production, railroads, all of this innovation happening. What was the thinking of government, if you can summarize it, right? And even people too, right? Like, for example, we touched a little bit on it, but not too much of like the protests that happened and like the strikes and unionization and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of tied to the government too, right? Like, so
it is.
What were those? What was that landscape that was going on in the 19th century?
Well, in the 19th century, there's this cliched view of the 19th century that sees it as this era of so-called laissez-faire, right? Anything goes. It's not laissez-faire. And in fact, if you look at the role, and again, hate to sound like a broken record, but if you look at the role that state governments play, state governments go a long way towards underwriting economic growth. They do geological surveys. They create corporate charters. In the United States, companies are chartered at the level of the state, right? Not the federal government. There are a few federal charters for transcontinental railroads and so forth, but mostly it's states that do the chartering. What the federal government did was it underwrote, in a similar way, a lot of this activity. It provided cheap land. It created rules that allowed for the rapid and pretty unfettered development of resources. I'll give you an example. The rule of capture, right? What the rule of capture says is that if you have land that is above oil, your property rights don't necessarily go all the way down to the bottom. So if someone is next to you, and let's say you don't want to use that oil, right? You want to sit on that oil. Well, someone can buy the land next to you and go right underneath. That's the whole argument in in There Will Be Blood, right? Like I drank your milkshake. I basically drilled and sucked all the oil that you thought you had. And so what the federal government does is it creates federal and state governments, both in the 19th century, create these conditions that one legal historian called the release of energy. In other words, the courts, the legislatures were all aimed at this idea of allowing entrepreneurship to flourish, sometimes to a detriment. Right. I'll give you another example that I always bring up in my history of capitalism class is the way that nuisances are redefined. So, for example, when railroads first started going through towns, these are steam railroads that are burning copious amounts of fuel, and they're just shooting out sparks and smoke everywhere. And these sparks, and when you run a railroad in the 19th century, you run it right through the middle of town, right? You know, not on the outskirts, because people, if they're not riding the railroad, they're walking, right? I mean, so you had to run it right through town.
No cars.
Yeah, and so these sparks would go and they would catch buildings on fire. And so local property owners said, look, this is a nuisance, right? And they asked the courts to basically tear down the railroad. There's this famous case in Louisville, Kentucky in the late 1830s. And the courts say, you know what? The societal benefit of the railroad outweighs your individual rights as a property owner.
Right.
And again and again and again, American courts make those decisions. Now, again, there are winners and losers. The losers are those individual property owners.
Right. Absolutely.
And the winners are those kind of tools of modern society, as they would often call them. You know, that a modern society needs people to make those kinds of sacrifices. And the same is true of labor unions. You mentioned labor. More often than not, state authorities, both federal and state, sided with the interests of capital. What they would argue, for example, is that property rights were being violated. Remember, one of the tenets of American capitalism and of the United States is the kind of sacrosanct right of property. And so if you were a striking worker on a factory ground, you were trespassing. You were violating private property. If you destroyed something that your boss had made, you were violating private property. To the point where if you look, for example, at the origins of the Pennsylvania State Police, it was actually the Pennsylvania Coal and Iron Police. And they were called that because their main job was to ensure that striking workers didn't disrupt coal and iron. So, and if you look at throughout most of the 19th and 20th century, and this is why I think that the anthracite strike of 1902 is so interesting, because Teddy Roosevelt basically said, we're not going to do what the federal government usually does, what we did in the Great Strike of 1877, what we did in the Homestead Strike, what we did in the Pullman Strike. These are all massive strikes involving thousands of workers. And the federal government inevitably sided with capital and would use, for example, federal or state, if it was a state militia troops, to put it down, put down the strike. And Roosevelt says, no, we're going to try to come up with some kind of bargain on this. And I make the argument that's the power of coal.
So it's like a
but if you look at the period, you look at the period before then, and with very few exceptions, state power and authority was vested in not allowing a kind of equitable pact between labor and capital. It mostly sided with capital. And again, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. Right. Disadvantage is we don't get the kind of working class political parties and working class kind of benefits like pensions and health care and stuff like that in the United States. What we do have are higher wages. When one sociologist was asked why there was no socialism in the United States, why didn't the United States, for example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, when a lot of European industrialized countries were coming up with old age pensions and health systems and benefits like that, why no socialism? And the sociologist Werner Sombart said that the American ship of socialism was wrecked upon the reefs of roast beef and apple pie. In other words, the high wages,
we're so
and the material
abundant.
conditions were so good in the United States that they didn't necessarily have the incentive to develop these kind of working class parties. And so the parties developed in these kind of strange ways in which we generally associate during this period certain parties with certain interests, but there's never really a viable kind of working class party in the same way that you had in for example, Germany, or you had in the UK with the Labour Party. So that's the role of the state, is to underwrite that kind of development, industrial development, for the most part.
And people can call it like corruption, right? Like,
sure,
because they're like taking side of the corporate interest or something like that, right? Like what is your thinking of all of that? Like, if you were making those decisions, how would you make those decisions? Like, if you're part of the court, if you're part of the legislature, do you have something that guides you in your thinking? Like some philosophy that tells you, oh, in this general, of course, like you have to look at every situation, but in this general direction is how I'm going to behave because of this.
It's hard to generalize, I would say, but I would say that for the most part, legislators and courts would look at the kind of balance between rights and opportunities, right? And more often than not, legislators certainly would focus on opportunities. The United States has always been a very kind of forward-looking country, right? And I guess it's because we're a young country, but there's always this kind of enthusiasm for development and growth and economic prosperity. And so I think that in many ways overshadows a lot of the concerns that people had. For example, in the 1830s, there was a pretty sizable movement at the state level against corporate chartering. They basically said, this is where the horrible monsters idea came up. They said, look, corporations amass power and wealth in ways that are undemocratic, right? And they create these inequities of wealth that create jealousies and all this animosity. And so what we should do is really limit the number of corporate charters that we're issuing. And the response to that was, so you want a country in which there aren't railroads, in which there aren't steamships, in which there aren't, that was always the response to that argument, that we needed progress. And it's one of the things that I think that we don't quite understand about the 19th century American mindset. There's a reason why when I'm writing this book on the Industrial Revolution and I stop it in the 1930s. In fact, I begin with a description of Herbert Hoover, who is not a particularly exciting figure, but I say Herbert Hoover is actually a revolutionary. He's a product of the Industrial Revolution. And I talk about his optimism, right? The 19th century, for a lot of Americans who were not enslaved or were not workers working for small wages, but a lot of Americans who were in power, those people that you're talking about, the judges, the legislators, and so forth, they had an optimism that we would find naive, right? And kind of silly. And in some cases dangerous, because they really did believe that nature was to be tamed, right? We need to get gold out of the hills in the West. So what we'll do is we'll develop a hydraulic mining system where we basically blast jets of water into the side of a hill and erode the entire hill and get it out. But we're getting a lot of gold, right? Another example, steamships. American steamships have high pressure steam engines, right? Now, many European designs did not have high pressure steam engines because they're dangerous. They tend to explode. Americans didn't care about that in an early age. You would see notices of a steamboat explosion, and these were common. And when a steamboat explodes, it just shoots, red hot steam everywhere, and there's splinters, and you'd have, tens, if not hundreds of deaths. And you'd see an account of a steamboat explosion. It would say, the Memphis Belle exploded, causing the loss of 30 souls. Before it exploded, however, it beat the record for the Louisville to Cincinnati run. That idea of progress and that idea of technological progress and material progress was so important to Americans. I'll give you another example. When Americans adopted locomotives, railroad locomotives, because they didn't invent them, the UK was the most innovative part for early locomotive design. They did two things to alter that design. They put headlights on it so that you could run in the dark, because we run 24/7. And they built this device called a cow catcher, right? So that basically if the livestock is on the railroads right away, the railroad's not stopping, right?
I had
catches it? Yeah, well, it doesn't catches it. No, you've never seen a cow catcher?
I guess like
it's like a pointy thing. It shoots it off. Yeah, I really upset a student once because I was explaining that in class, and she said, "Well, how does it catch the cow, doctor?" And I said, "Well, it doesn't really catch the cow as much as it pushes it off to the side very violently
in two parts."
She was like, "Oh my God," and I was like, "Yeah, but so here's the thing though. That farmer could say that's a nuisance, right?" Of course, would have never sided with that farmer. They would have said, "No, the benefit of that train going 40 to 50 miles an hour,
put a fence, right?
It far outweighs your individual property rights." And so that's what I mean by optimism is that they had this kind of unfailing confidence and belief in progress and the ability of humans to solve these issues. And I think that a couple of things, World War I and the Great Depression, really provided a check on that, right? World War I especially, where we saw that industrialization can bring some pretty horrible things like the machine gun, right, to bear on people. And then the Great Depression created an even bigger crisis of confidence in capitalism. But before that, Americans, at least Americans in positions of power and Americans who could afford to be, were relentlessly optimistic about the economic future of the country.
What do you think that shift started to happen? Maybe it was because it was one of those Okay, for sure. But for example, like you mentioned Roosevelt, right? Like Roosevelt was like 19.
Yeah. I guess you could say so there were ideas.
Transition, right?
Yeah, I should correct myself. Globally, I would say World War I, but in the United States, there was an idea that this industrial system had created excesses that needed to be checked, and there were a series of reformers called the Progressives that came into power in state governments, and then Roosevelt is considered one of the first kind of progressive presidents. And he does things like he looks at, the meatpacking industry and he says, this is too much, right? There needs to be some kind of government regulation of this. Because of course the solution before was a free market solution. The idea is if you ate a can of beef from Adams Beef Packing Company and you died because it was poison, well, then people would realize not to buy that beef and the markets would clear, right? But, and that's the argument that in the long run, that problem will solve itself. But then famously, an economist once said, in the long run, we're all dead, right? In other words, there are short-run solutions to this. And what Roosevelt and the progressives often argued is there are some things that shouldn't be left up to free markets, right? And safety, consumer safety is one of them. So it's during the progressive era that we start to see this idea that, there are excesses that need to be kind of checked. Antitrust hadn't done it. Government regulation throughout most of the late 19th century was largely a failure. They tried to kind of regulate railroad rates, and there were the populists who kind of came up and said we should nationalize the railroads and so forth. But they ended up losing pretty critical elections in the end. And so it's with the progressives it starts. And then I think with World War II is when you see the more kind of bigger psychological idea that progress is maybe that we're not always moving upward and outward, right? And then the Depression and then World War II. I mean, you think about that period from 1914 through 1945 and the kind of things that it demonstrated that industrial society could do, that it was capable not only of magical things like flight and speedy travel, but it was capable of mass murder, right? And I think at that point,
as you said, machine guns, and even taking it to the extreme, like nuclear weapons,
concentration camps, all those sorts of things that really were influenced by kind of industrial systems. And I think that after that, we became a lot more skeptical about it in a way that somebody, say, in the 1830s or 1870s, who certainly had a lot to be pessimistic about in terms of political developments. I mean, you look at the United States in the 1860s. I mean, I don't want to suggest to you that everybody was thinking everything was fantastic. I mean, we had a civil war going on. But if you look at it in the economic realm, and the question you asked about policymakers and stuff, how do they feel? They still had a great deal of optimism. They believed, for example, this is the other thing that I always say is we know how Reconstruction ended for African Americans. And we know how the late 19th century ended for African Americans in the South. Horribly. We had the Jim Crow South. We had a lot of violence during the Reconstruction years, and ultimately Reconstruction failed to produce the kind of racial equality. However, there were people up north, industrialists, who were making this argument that, like, oh, all we need to do is build some railroads, build some factories, have some schools that teach basic, kind of arithmetic skills and mechanical skills, and the South will blossom, right? Incredible amounts of optimism. Now, what they failed to take into account was the deep-seated racism a lot of white folks in the South.
Yeah, sure.
But I always say, the 19th century, there's certainly negative things that happened, as with all of history. But I think that what strikes me, the reason I find it a fascinating century, the reason why I devoted my life to it, is you've got these incredible contrasts of blind optimism, but then also horrific things that happen, like slavery and Reconstruction and the Jim Crow South. And I find the interplay between those things to be industrialization is the same way, right? I mean, you have vast amounts of wealth created and material standards increased, but you also have breaker boys. You have 14-year-olds that are basically lurching over these conveyor belts, picking out rocks. You have kids working in textile factories. You have the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I mean, that's not 19th century, but it's an outgrowth of it, I would argue, where managers locked workers in the sweatshop in order to keep them from taking breaks and to make them more productive. And then a fire broke out and they were incinerated to death. I mean, so all of those things are a part of that story. We got to take the negative with the positive. But when I try to kind of put myself in the place of a 19th century industrialist, the overwhelming sense I get is the kind of faith and optimism in markets and technology.
Yeah, which definitely could be a good, like at the very least, the spirit, it's definitely worth preserving right now, right? Like, for example, you've seen a lot of negative thinking of like the current state of the country, the current state of the world, right? Like you could also correlate it even with increasing amounts of animosity against capitalism, right? Would you say that could be the case? Like there's some correlation in there.
Oh yeah.
And then as you were saying, right? Like listening to those lessons of history, it could improve our current lives significantly.
Well,
like to increase like our positivism, right? Like our optimism to the future that, yeah, we'll figure it out, right? We'll solve the problems. We'll cooperate with each other, right? Instead of attacking each other, right?
If you look at the disruptive aspects of, say, capitalism, and particularly industrial capitalism, there were people that opposed it for sure throughout the 19th century. There were people that thought it created vast inequalities and it needed to be checked and so forth. And the analogy I would use now when I talk about the relevance of what I study is a lot of people felt about industrialization the way they felt about, say, artificial intelligence now. This is this thing that is it's high tech. I don't really understand it.
Right.
I mean, a lot of Americans didn't understand how a internal combustion engine worked. They could see what it did, right? And people don't quite understand it, and it looks like it's going to put a lot of people out of work, and that's what industrialization did, right? But at the same time, it created new opportunities. In the end, it raised living standards. And so I think that, obviously there's a lot of hype about AI. There's a lot of fear about AI. And I find that one of the ways to kind of grapple with it is to study things like the Industrial Revolution and say, there is going to be some short-term disruption here. People will lose their jobs for sure. There will be whole industries that are wiped out in the same way that in the Industrial Revolution there were. In the long run will be better, but then people will argue with me and they'll say, well, you just said in the long run we're all dead, right? There are short-term concerns to have here as well. But it's why, for example, people are wondering what should the federal government do about AI, And in the same way, people were asking, what should the federal government do about railroads, right? Tried to regulate them, it didn't quite work, right? So I think that we can draw those kinds of lessons from the 19th century and apply it to our own.
What other types of lessons do you draw? And
inequality and
I was going to mention that.
Right. Like whether or not the role of government is to preserve, and this is kind of a false dichotomy, I realize, but to preserve equal opportunity or equal outcomes.
Yeah, because for example, when you were talking about all of these questions, I think when a lot of people talk about capitalism, one of the main criticisms is that it fosters necessarily inequality, right? Like
for sure
monopolies happen, and then there's this guy, as we can see currently, right? Like there's guys that with the snap of their finger can change my life in like ways that I have no clue about, right? Like they have an amount of wealth that is stupid to comprehend.
Yeah.
But am I okay with that, right? Like that's kind of like what are those lessons that the 19th century gives you when you think about inequality, when you think about, like what should both the government's role in inequality, related to inequality is, and what is our own personal role when we think about inequality?
Those are big questions. I wish I could just fall back and say, I'm a historian of coal. I don't want to answer those questions, but I'll try. I mean,
not today.
So, I think that, first of all, in the 19th century, there were such deep inequalities based on things that thankfully we don't have anymore. Inequalities based on gender, inequalities based on race. And a lot of those assumptions that folks had in the 19th century, thankfully, are not with us today. So I'll focus on not on those per se, but on the idea of economic inequality. And I think in many ways, the system got overwhelmed. The American system of Republican government in many ways got overwhelmed by the Industrial Revolution by the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s. And that they could not really fathom, the founders could not really fathom a handful of individuals having that much power and control. And they probably would have been shocked by it. They would have seen it as a kind of tyrannical form of political economy. So actually, now that I think about it, I don't know that the 19th century offers us any good lessons about solving the kind of persistent inequality that we have now. And that's why what I would often do is when folks would ask those kinds of questions, is ask them if they think it's appropriate to separate the kind of material and political aspects of this question. In other words, the Industrial Revolution and industrial America undoubtedly raised the material prosperity of everybody, but not equally, right? And one can argue that that first statement is a statement of material history, right? The second statement, but not equally, that's a political question. Yeah. Now that it's somewhat controversial if any historian says they can separate the material from political, and there are some folks that will say you can't. But I like to ask that of people, because my book, for the most part, Home Friars, was looking at the kind of technological systems and looking at the material development of industrialization. I wasn't asking those kinds of questions to a certain extent of inequality, and that's a flaw in the book, right? I mean, I'm really it was in a series called How Things Worked, and so what I was basically saying is how the coal stove worked in the United States and what were the implications of it from a material perspective. I didn't ask how coal stoves worked and whether or not it resigned thousands of young men in Pennsylvania to lives of kind of abject misery and poverty. So, that this is a very, very fancy way of me trying to avoid your question.
Right, that's fine.
I realize that, but it's I can only do so much with energy and coal.
Yeah, like for example, the way that I like to think about it. It sort of works sometimes. It has its flaws sometimes, but it just try to think of it like, okay, if we're unequal, like, am I bothered by that? Right?
Yeah.
Like, if there's this guy or like this group of people that have this political, like, not political, because then if it's political, then I would personally be more against it. But if economical, right? Like, if economical wealth and economical power, like, am I really bothered by that? Like, my life is pretty good, right? Like, I don't have too many complaints. I try to not have too many complaints, so it's like I'm kind of okay with it, right? Like, have you thought about those types of questions for your life, personally?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think to be a citizen is to ask those kinds of questions. And personally, I think I fall more on the equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes question, and that I would be more bothered if we had the kind of system, for example, where you have in some kleptocratic countries where somebody builds something, works really hard, builds it, and then because they're not politically well connected, it just gets confiscated. Right? That would bother me more than living in a country, that allows certain people to become wealthy. Now, what you don't want to do is create incentives for bad behavior, right? And for felonious behavior, for scammers, for things like that. That's one thing that I would say in the 19th century that is not a particularly good legacy of it, is that you got this doctrine that developed called caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware. And what it meant was that a lot of 19th century Americans were swindled. In fact, one of the books that I'm assigning in my history of capitalism classes is this book by a historian named Ed Belyson at Duke, and it's called Fraud. And it's all about the attempts, the really, really serious attempts that American public policymakers had to try to cut down on the sheer amount of fraud that was occurring throughout the 19th and 20th century. In other words, when you open up an economy like that and you basically say, look, we're going to allow all sorts of opportunities to occur and all sorts of creative destruction and entrepreneurship to occur, some people inevitably are going to come up with things like Ponzi schemes and scams like that. And the question is that the price you pay for having a kind of free market capitalist economy? Are you always going to have those people? That's something I struggle with, right? Advertising is another thing, I mean, we have kind of internalized it, but, isn't it annoying that basically when I go to my mail and pick up my mail, I throw away 90% of it because it's just ads, right? Anytime you pick anything up, there's advertisements, there's people trying to sell you something. That gets annoying after a while. So, but again, they're trade-offs. I would rather live in a society with a lot of ads than a society where your consumer choices are really, really limited.
Yeah. And I think of those kinds of societies, for example, personally, I connect with that question because I was born in Venezuela and I came here.
A big oil company.
Yep. And I came here at 18 years. So you could see, or at least not me personally, because I was until 18, right? But like my parents telling me, like this person, because he was not politically connected to the government, then they were either at the best case scenario is like they were ignored, or like they were not, like they were blocked, right? Like that was the best case scenario, right? Like they prevented him from doing some sort of business deal or something like that. Right. Worst case scenario is like they kidnap him and they murder his family, right?
Right.
So I would rather definitely, like, that's why it's also interesting for me, this question, because you could say that, and I think many people would agree that the US, for example, is like embraces capitalism more. Venezuela does not embrace capitalism as much, and that thinking has consequences that has led to these two types of situations, right? Like I'm not necessarily worried that I'll get my family murdered and thrown in jail because of the things that I say, or the businesses that I will do in my day-to-day life, right? Compared to Venezuela.
Yeah.
You
don't have, there's not as much of a, I mean, there's obviously some politics involved, but there's not as much of a political aspect of doing business in the United States as there is in Venezuela, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Venezuela is a really interesting case with oil in that, one of the things that Chavez did that was so bad for the oil industry is he basically sacked all the competent people in the oil company and put in his cronies and family members and stuff. And then when you have that kind of, system, people lose faith in it. And that's the thing that I think folks worry about the most about what's going on now, whatever side of the political spectrum you fall on, is people seem to be losing confidence in the system, right? And if you don't have confidence that, for example, your basic property rights are going to be respected, that your human rights are going to be respected, if you don't have that confidence, then it really limits, your range of possibilities.
So have you considered, for example, like societies where the amount of government interaction is as minimal as possible, right? Like not even addressing those questions, leaving those questions to be answered to private institutions, right? Like, have you thought about it? Because how I'm thinking about it is that could be in the direction of more the laissez-faire that you were talking about, that people thought the 19th century was. And in a sense, it was, right? Like, in a sense, as you mentioned, that the government was mostly siding with if there's an issue, let the businesses, like private enterprises, decide this issue, right? What?
I think that there's limits to that, I mean, for example, I don't know what would happen if, for example, they got rid of the FAA. Would companies decide?
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, so you're right in that there was like so I used that example of the steamship blowing up, and they were like, yeah, but before then it broke the speed record, right? So that's great. I wonder what would happen if their government kind of got out of the business of regulating air travel. Probably have a lot more accidents, and I just don't think that, unlike 19th century Americans, I don't think 21st century Americans have much of an appetite for that. So there's obviously a sweet spot of regulation, right? Is that you want regulation when it affects you. You don't want it when it doesn't affect you.
Yeah, because you could argue that, for example, the thing that would give me hope in those situations is there's many things that are definitely not regulated at all, and they work wonderfully, right? Well, not with its problems, but like the music industry or like academia in some sense, like not where the funding comes from necessarily, but like how things are considered to be good, right? Like journals and things like that. They're private companies for the most part, from my understanding. Yeah. And like even in engineering, you mentioned, for example, like the FAA, that what's stopping like a private or like some corporation to enforce not enforce, but like set a standard that is recommended instead of enforced. And like people know that, okay, if this is the standard that is the best, even though it's not forced, like it's in my interest to follow it, right? Something like that.
Well, I'll use the airline industry again as an example, because for many decades of the early industry, it was regulated much more than it is now, right? And that basically what the American Airlines found, if you would have flown an American airline in the 1960s or 1970s, when I was a real little kid, you only flew for like funerals or really important things like that, and business people were the only people that it could have worked to fly, because it was incredibly expensive. I mean, well beyond the reach of most Americans.
Right.
And planes would fly half full, sometimes 3 or 4 people on a plane. The first time I flew, I was a little kid. I don't even remember it, but my parents tell me that there were like 6 people on the plane. From St. Louis to Pittsburgh. Right. And the stewardesses, flight attendants, played with me the entire time. because they were bored and they didn't have anything to do. So they played with me and, entertained me. I wonder what
the prices of those things would be. Like
hundreds of dollars, which in 1970s
was
very
expensive.
Very expensive.
Yeah. Okay, that's probably
and then, and then the next time we flew was for another funeral. And the plane was relatively full, and apparently I threw a fit because I was the flight attendants wouldn't play with me.
Right.
So, but then in the 1970s, they rolled back a lot of those regulations. They basically said, look, the FAA is going to determine that air travel is safe, and we're going to regulate air traffic. That's still going to be under our purview. But in terms of determining prices and routes and all that kind of stuff, we're pretty much going to leave that up to the private sector. And what ended up happening is airline travel basically got really cheap and affordable for people. Now, again, there's a trade-off, right? Airline travel was really nice when it was expensive because the only way companies couldn't compete on price because the price was set, right? It was regulated. So what they would compete on are like perks, right? Great meals and stuff, and great service. And of course, when you're competing, you're trying to cut costs, and so you cut all those down. So I would argue that flying Pan Am in the 1960s probably was a lot more pleasurable than flying Spirit in the 2010s,
absolutely,
2020s, right? And so, but I'm sure that the prices, it was astronomical to fly. Whereas now,
and you can say that there's always those options exist, right? Like if you want to fly Emirates or something like that, if you want to have like a bed for yourself and like a
and that's party. The argument is that if you want to fly first class and you can afford it, you can do it. But if you can't afford to fly first class, you can fly economy. Now, the airline industry is maybe an unfair example because I think that's considered one of the best examples of deregulation. In that basically what didn't happen. So when they deregulated banking, that's when we got a lot of bad behavior and that's how we got and ultimately when they deregulated banking and mortgages and stuff like that, that's when we got the 2008 crisis because so many people were acting in bad faith, right? But again, this is what I always tell my students that when I teach it in a couple weeks, the 2008 crisis, because it was the result of kind of bad behavior and short-sightedness and all that, it's a very 19th century phenomenon. It's not the Great Depression, right? It's not a repeat of the Great Depression. It's a repeat of a 19th century panic, which you would have every now and then. Because the system was so deregulated and because the state wasn't stepping in, what you would often have are these kind of booms where times are really great and then busts where everyone loses. And it was not uncommon for a 19th century business person to go bankrupt 3 or 4 times over the course of their career. Build up a company, bust, build it up, go bust. If you're comfortable with that kind of system, then don't have any kind of regulations because that's what the 19th century produced. And that's another kind of reason why I think the kind of underlying optimism of so many Americans who could afford to be optimistic at that time, bankruptcy is a traumatic thing now. I don't think people go into it very lightly, but back in the 1830s and 1840s, a lot of small business people they'd lose it all, and then they would have to build back up again. They're optimistic about, kind of building their wealth again. And that's what you get with an unregulated economy, or these these incredible booms and busts. And again, I don't think Americans have the political appetite for that anymore.
Right. Yeah, it would be interesting to talk about why that is the case. Like a million different things that happen over like 19th century, 20th century, 21st century.
Yeah.
But we've been talking about like questions in terms of decision making and psychology and how all of that affects oneself. You're a professor of history. What would you normally say to students, maybe in general, and or students of history, like any advice in a sense, right? Like you have students, what do you tell them? What do you advise them to do? Like to think about like the things that has happened before in history and apply it to your life, or like consider it to apply it to your life, or things like that. Like what advice can you give them?
I guess one of the things that I always try to teach in my class says, it's the idea of trade-offs, the idea that, maybe not from a personal perspective, but from a societal perspective, when you're looking at things, there's very rarely kind of clear answers to the question that don't involve some sort of trade-off, right? So in talking about like fossil fuels, well, we should get rid of fossil fuels. Well, that's going to throw a lot of people out of work in the meantime. If you're comfortable with that, that's great. And so, that's one of the things that I try to teach them is to think about the implications of any action, and to not just simply say there's got to be a simple solution to this, to look at the complexity of problems, not to make them more complex than they need to be, but to look at it from that kind of sensitivity. And what I think what history does is it allows you to see the kind of broader context of a lot of these issues. And it allows you to see that, like, in any given action, in any given policy, there might be winners and losers. There might be people that are very gravely affected by this, and there might be people that think that this policy would be fantastic. But I think what history does, at least the kind of history that I study, is it makes you sensitive to those kinds of issues.
What are you grateful for?
My students, first and foremost, because they keep me honest. They let me know when things are boring, and they allow me to continue to kind of think about these things from their perspective. You can get a little jaded when you become a historian. You can kind of look at how things always seem to go poorly, right? But then when you're in a group of students who are just starting off their lives, and you're talking about history with them, and you're seeing them kind of see this history for the first time, that's really exciting and enthusiastic for me. So that's the kind of thing I'm grateful for currently. If I look back on my past, I have to say, there's 3 professors at Purdue who were at Purdue. One of them is deceased. One of them was retired. One of them, I think, is still actually working there, who really influenced me. So first, Mike Morrison, who was this professor who taught the U.S. History Survey back when I didn't know what I wanted to do. And this was at 7:30 in the morning at Purdue University. And I think it was the spring semester. So I started going in January. And if you've been to Northern Indiana in January, it is cold and dark. And there is every opportunity to skip that class because it was a large lecture. He didn't take attendance. And he was so fantastic. And he taught me that history has these arguments, and that history it's not just rote memorization. When I was in high school, I hated history. I thought history was all about like memorizing stuff. Then I realized I was actually reading a lot of history. My dad would take me to historic sites, and I loved those. And what Mike did was just kind of made history come alive for me, right? And then Randy Roberts was this historian that I took later on when I was doing upper division classes. And he, in many ways, kind of taught me the craft of history. He was a big biographer. And so I really got into biographies for a while, and this idea of how you interact with a figure, whether you like them or dislike them, and kind of spending time with them. And he was also a really dynamic teacher as well. I mean, different than Mike, but really good at what he did. And he actually encouraged me to go to graduate school and kind of do something. And then a final professor who I never had as an undergrad, but he was at Purdue as well, who really helped me become a professional historian, was John Larson, who wrote this great book on internal improvements. And he really demonstrated to me the kind of mentoring that we get even after we get our jobs and our dissertation and stuff. And that he really helped me understand what it was to be a kind of researcher and to kind of be a kind of student of history at a later stage in my career. It's easy to be enthusiastic about it when you're earlier and it's all new to you. But what John taught me was to take these kinds of questions that we've been talking about today, about inequality and trade-offs and all that kind of stuff, and to kind of use history to at least come to some kind of understanding of it. So, those 3 guys, and Purdue is not known particularly as a kind of liberal arts school, right? It's known as an engineering school. And so I feel particularly blessed that I was able to be there and have that kind of first-rate history department give me so much individual attention, because the nice thing about being a history major at Purdue is you're only like one of 90. When I went to graduate school at Wisconsin, they had hundreds of history majors. If I had gone an undergraduate at Wisconsin, I never would have had the kind of individual attention I got at Purdue. So I'm grateful for my students now and for my mentors back in the day.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, John, and Randy, for making Dr. Sean Adams. Thank you so much.
Thanks. This is great.
Yeah, this was awesome. Capitalism allows you to make those trade-offs, right?
It does, yes.
Allows you to give you the decision, right? Like, do you want to be in the forest and not have cell phones and not, right, like live from your own land and then be chill there? Or do you want to go to the city and go to axe throwing fair and you have your iPhone and you invite your friends and then you go to the disco party, right? But then maybe you have to work longer, or like you have to sit on a desk that maybe you don't like, or things like that. Like, it allows you to make these decisions, and it allows you to make that determination of what is the priority for myself.
It's choice.